In colonial Maryland's tobacco fields, beneath the rolling hills of an Arundel County, there's a secret the Catholic Church has spent over 2 centuries attempting to erase. From 1734 to 1768, a family whose name still inspires fear in elderly parishioners, the Thorntons, seized control of 12 parishes across the colony. Instead of serving God, they manipulated the sacred act of confession to construct a terrifying empire that makes modern organized crime look like child's play. What you are about to hear is a story assembled from sealed church archives, coded journals found inside a Maryland farmhouse wall in 1892, and testimonies suppressed for nearly 3 centuries. This is more than just a story of religious corruption. It's a tale of how 3 men utilized the confessional booth for blackmail, poison, and the most twisted abuse of sacred trust ever documented in American history, to control an entire colony. Before we delve into the story of the Thornton family and their web of ecclesiastical terror, I must ask you something. This channel is not for everyone, only for the bravest souls daring to unearth the dark secrets that history has tried to bury. If you are one of the few brave enough to listen to these forbidden tales, please subscribe and hit that notification bell. I am also curious. Please drop a comment below telling me what state or city you're listening from. Are you brave enough to let us know where you are as we embark on this nightmare together? Now, let's return to Maryland in 1734, where evil wore a priest's collar. The autumn of 1734 found colonial Maryland in a delicate position. It was a religious battleground with growing Anglican pressure, but the Calvert family's Catholic influence still held sway. Nestled along the Severn River, about 20 miles southeast of Annapolis, the small port town of Havenwood represented everything the Catholic Church was fighting to preserve. Though not large by colonial standards, with perhaps 800 people living on tobacco plantations and in small businesses, it was highly influential. The town's Catholic families controlled a significant portion of the tobacco trade flowing through the Chesapeake Bay, with their names on shipping manifests that reached from London to the Caribbean. The Curthers family owned 3 plantations and a merchant fleet. The Whitmore family managed the largest tobacco warehouse between Baltimore and Annapolis. The Ashfords built their fortune on tobacco and the profitable, though less discussed, slave trade. At the center of this Catholic enclave was St. Bartholomew's Church, a modest brick building whose bell tower was visible to ships on the Severn River. Unlike grand European cathedrals, St. Bartholomew's reflected the practical nature of colonial architecture. It had sturdy oak pews, plain glass windows, and thick walls built to withstand Maryland's humid summers and occasional pirate raids. But it was what was inside that would make St. Bartholomew's infamous. In the late summer of 1734, Father Thomas Thornton arrived to serve as the new parish priest. He brought an unusual request: to install 4 new, elaborately constructed wooden confessional booths, which he claimed would better serve his growing congregation's spiritual needs. Father Thornton was not a typical priest. He was tall and imposing, with prematurely gray hair and piercing blue eyes. He spoke with the refined accent of someone educated in European seminaries, yet he seemed to understand the rough realities of colonial life better than most men of the cloth. When he smiled in those first few months, it never quite reached his eyes. Parishioners at St. Bartholomew's were unaware that for the previous 5 years, Father Thornton had been traveling Maryland, visiting Catholic parishes, and meticulously noting their wealthiest and most influential members. He had studied their business dealings, family connections, strengths, and, most importantly, their potential weaknesses. He had not come to Havenwood to save souls. He had come to harvest secrets. The confessional booths Father Thornton installed were masterpieces of deceptive craftsmanship, built by his nephew Marcus, a skilled carpenter who supposedly learned his trade in Philadelphia. Each appeared to be a standard 3-chamber confessional, with a central compartment for the priest and 2 kneeling chambers for penitents. The dark oak and intricate carved crosses gave them an air of sacred solemnity that impressed even the wealthiest parishioners. However, hidden within the walls of each was a horrific innovation. Marcus Thornton had installed a series of hollow metal tubes that ran from each penitent's chamber to a concealed recording chamber beneath the church. These tin tubes were carefully angled to carry sound without distortion, allowing every whispered confession to be heard and recorded in the basement. The recording system was ingeniously simple. The metal tubes fed into small echo chambers lined with curved metal surfaces that amplified sound, allowing someone in the basement to hear conversations from the confessionals above with startling clarity. Father Thornton took it one step further. He trained his younger nephew, Samuel, to transcribe these conversations using a secret cipher, creating permanent records of every confession made in St. Bartholomew's, the first victim of the Thornton family's plot, revealed himself on a cold February morning in 1735. Completely unaware he was walking into a trap 6 months in the making, Richard Whitmore, one of Havenwood's most successful tobacco merchants, entered St. Bartholomew's, carrying a burden that had consumed him for weeks. His reputation was built on integrity, fair dealing, and moral rectitude. However, Richard Whitmore had a secret that could destroy everything he had built. 3 months earlier, in Annapolis, he had met Catherine Mills, a beautiful 19-year-old indentured servant working in a tavern. What began as casual conversation had turned into adultery, one of the gravest sins in Catholic doctrine. As Whitmore knelt in the confessional, his voice barely a whisper, he confessed his guilt to Father Thornton. He spoke of his shame, his betrayal, of his wife Margaret, and his plan to purchase Catherine's indenture contract, fearing discovery would ruin his family. Father Thornton listened with practiced compassion, offering words of comfort and assuring Whitmore of God's forgiveness. He prescribed a penance of prayers and donations, then blessed Whitmore as he left with tears of relief. Meanwhile, in the basement, Samuel Thornton had transcribed every word of Whitmore's confession, encoding the details into his uncle's cipher. Catherine Mills, indentured servant at the Brass Lantern Tavern in Annapolis, contract holder Jonathan Pierce, relationship ongoing since November 1734. Whitmore plans to purchase indenture within the month. This sacred confession was transformed into an instrument of blackmail. Exactly 1 week later, Father Thornton requested a private meeting with Whitmore, claiming he needed to discuss a matter of urgent spiritual importance. They met in the priest's study on a Thursday evening, a room lit by candles that cast dancing shadows on the walls lined with theological books. "Richard," Father Thornton began, his voice warm and seemingly genuine, "I've been praying extensively about our conversation last week, and God has revealed a path forward that might ease your burden." Whitmore leaned forward, hoping for a solution to his moral crisis. "The church has significant expenses coming in the next few months," Father Thornton continued. "We're planning to expand our charitable works, perhaps establish a fund to help indentured servants in difficult situations, young women particularly, who find themselves in vulnerable circumstances." The priest paused, allowing the implications to sink in before continuing. "I believe God is calling you to make a substantial contribution to this fund, perhaps £50 initially, with monthly donations of £10 thereafter. This would demonstrate the sincerity of your repentance while helping others who might find themselves in situations similar to Miss Mills." The color drained from Whitmore's face as he realized what was happening. Father Thornton was using his sacred confession to demand money. The priest's benevolent expression never changed, but Whitmore saw something cold and calculating in his blue eyes. "Father, our conversation was under the seal of confession," Whitmore stammered. "And it remains so," Father Thornton replied smoothly. "I would never violate that sacred trust. But God speaks to me in many ways, Richard, sometimes through prayer, sometimes through divine revelation. He has revealed your desire to help young Catherine and I'm simply offering a sanctified way to channel that charitable impulse." Whitmore sat in stunned silence, his merchant's mind quickly calculating the implications. £50 was a substantial but manageable sum. £10 monthly would be harder but not impossible. The alternative, having his affair exposed, would destroy his marriage, business, and reputation. "And if I were to contribute to this charitable fund," Whitmore asked, "then I believe God would bless your discretion in all your personal matters." Father Thornton replied, "The church has always been a sanctuary for those seeking to live righteous lives, away from the prying eyes of gossips and busybodies." Whitmore agreed to the payments, telling himself he was performing an act of charity that might help other young women. He had no idea he was the first of what would become hundreds of victims, or that his confession was a test case for a blackmail system that would spread like a plague across Maryland. That night, as Whitmore walked home, he felt a chill that had nothing to do with the February wind. He couldn't shake the feeling that his life had fundamentally changed, and that he had crossed an invisible threshold from which there was no return. Behind him, the bell tower of St. Bartholomew's pointed to the star-filled sky like a dark finger pointing toward heaven, or perhaps somewhere else entirely. The success of the Whitmore blackmail convinced Father Thornton that his system was not only viable but far more profitable than he had initially imagined. Over the following months, he began implementing the second phase of his plan, a systematic expansion that would transform colonial Maryland's religious landscape into his personal criminal empire. The key to this expansion lay with his two nephews, both carefully groomed for their roles. Marcus, the elder at 28, had the technical skills to construct the modified confessionals. Samuel, barely 21, had been trained since childhood in transcription and codes. The truly diabolical part of the scheme was that both young men were legitimately ordained priests, having completed their seminary education in Baltimore, under their uncle's guidance, by the spring of 1735. Father Thornton had secured appointments for his nephews at 2 additional parishes. Marcus was assigned to St. Michael's in Easton, while Samuel took over the struggling parish of St. Joseph's near Chestertown. Each appointment came with the same request: permission to install new confessional booths. Their expansion strategy was methodical and patient. They didn't attempt to blackmail every parishioner who confessed a secret. Instead, they focused on productive scenes, transgressions committed by individuals with both the wealth to pay substantial sums and the social standing that made exposure genuinely devastating. Adultery was ideal, but they also targeted embezzlement, tax evasion, illegal business practices, and other forms of corruption common in colonial commerce. Their communication system was as sophisticated as their confessionals, using a network of merchant contacts and traveling salesmen. The 3 priests maintained correspondence through coded letters that appeared to discuss routine church business but contained detailed intelligence on potential victims. A letter about a spiritual awakening among tobacco farmers might actually be a report on several plantation owners confessing to tax cheating. A request for more prayer books for the Women's Society could be coded. Instructions about a wealthy widow's affair with her overseer by the end of 1735. The Thornton network was generating substantial income from 12 regular victims across 3 parishes. Richard Whitmore remained their most reliable source, his monthly payments having increased to £15 as Father Thornton claimed the church's charitable needs had grown. However, the Whitmore case taught the Thorntons a crucial lesson about managing their victims' psychology, rather than simply demanding payment for silence. Father Thornton developed a sophisticated justification system that allowed his victims to maintain their self-respect while paying extortion money. The money was always framed as charitable donations, penance payments, or contributions to specific church projects. Victims were encouraged to see themselves as generous benefactors, not blackmail targuzza, psychological manipulation that reduced the likelihood of rebellion. The system's effectiveness was most clearly demonstrated in the case of Edmund Curthers, the wealthy plantation owner, whose shipping business dominated the Chesapeake Bay. Curthers had confessed to systematically underreporting his cargo manifests to avoid customs duties, a practice that, while common, was technically treason. When Father Thornton approached him about a substantial contribution to the church's mission for the poor, Curthers initially resisted, but the priest's gentle reminder that God sees all our commercial dealings, even those conducted in the shadows of the customs house, was enough to secure his cooperation. Within 6 months, Curthers was contributing £25 monthly to what he believed was a fund to help impoverished Catholic families. The psychological toll on their victims became apparent as the months passed. Richard Whitmore, once known for his jovial demeanor, became increasingly withdrawn and anxious. He began attending Mass daily, as if excessive piety could balance his guilt. His wife, Margaret, noticed the change but attributed it to business pressures. Edmund Curthers developed different symptoms. Always a meticulous record keeper, he became obsessed with his business documents, spending hours each evening reviewing manifests. His slaves reported that he would sometimes wake up in the middle of the night to personally inspect cargo loads that had already been checked. But the most disturbing transformation occurred in the parishes themselves. The Thornton priests had created an atmosphere of spiritual intensity that bordered on fanaticism. Their sermons focused heavily on hidden sin, divine punishment, and the necessity of complete honesty with God. They encouraged frequent confession, sometimes suggesting that parishioners who went more than a week without confessing were risking eternal damnation. This spiritual pressure created a feedback loop that fed the blackmail system. Terrified parishioners began confessing not only major transgressions, but also minor indiscretions and unethical business dealings. The Thorntons' confession records grew thick with intelligence about colonial Maryland's elite, creating a comprehensive database of secrets. By early 1736, Father Thornton was ready for the third phase of his plan, a dramatic expansion that would extend his network throughout Maryland and potentially into neighboring colonies. He had identified 16 additional parishes and began recruiting family and trusted associates to operate the confession recording systems. But this expansion faced a significant obstacle. The Catholic Church's hierarchy in Baltimore had noticed the unusual construction projects. Bishop Carroll had questioned the need for such elaborate confessional installations in small parishes, and there were rumors he was considering formal inspections. The solution Father Thornton devised would be both his greatest triumph and the beginning of his ultimate downfall. It involved a level of corruption so profound that it would threaten the very foundations of Catholic authority in colonial Maryland and force the Thorntons to cross a line from which there could be no return. The winter of 1736 brought an unexpected crisis that would test the Thornton network's resilience. Isabella Ashford, the daughter of a prominent Catholic family in Havenwood, began to suspect that something was fundamentally wrong with the confessions she was making at St. Bartholomew's. Isabella, 19, had a sharp intelligence that colonial society typically wasted on women. She had been educated by private tutors, spoke fluent French and Latin, and had developed a scholarly interest in Catholic theology. This education would be Father Thornton's first serious miscalculation. The previous autumn, Isabella had confessed to Father Thornton that she was secretly reading books the Church considered inappropriate for unmarried women. It was a minor transgression, but Father Thornton saw an opportunity to control the Ashford family fortune. Within 2 weeks of her confession, Isabella noticed that Father Thornton had started incorporating specific references to young women who contaminate their minds with dangerous ideas into his Sunday sermons. When he requested a private meeting with her father to discuss the spiritual welfare of young people, Isabella's suspicions crystallized into certainty. But Isabella was not content to just suspect. She began a systematic analysis of Father Thornton's behavior. She noted which parishioners were called for private meetings and tried to connect them to their previous confessions. She paid attention to which families suddenly increased their charitable donations and tried to identify what they might have confessed. Most importantly, she began to test her theory with carefully controlled experiments. She confessed different fabricated sins to Father Thornton, stealing small items, having improper thoughts about married men, and even inventing a story about secretly reading Protestant religious texts. In each case, she watched for signs that Father Thornton was using her confessions to manipulate her family. When she confessed to borrowing a silk handkerchief, his next sermon included pointed references to those who take what doesn't belong to them. When she invented a romantic interest in a married merchant, the priest began counseling her father about the importance of finding her a husband before her. Natural feminine weaknesses led her into temptation, but the experiment that convinced her she was dealing with something far more sinister involved a deliberate lie about her family's business. She confessed to having overheard her father planning to avoid customs duties by falsely declaring a shipment of European goods as religious materials. Her father was scrupulously honest, so this confession was pure fiction. However, within days, Father Thornton requested a private meeting with James Ashford to discuss the spiritual implications of certain business practices. Isabella realized with growing horror that Father Thornton was systematically using sacred confessions to blackmail parishioners. Her investigation also revealed something more disturbing. The operation extended far beyond St. Bartholomew's. Through discreet inquiries, she discovered that several other Catholic parishes had recently installed new confessional booths. When she heard the priests' names, Marcus and Samuel Thornton, a pattern emerged, suggesting a coordinated criminal enterprise operating under the cover of religious authority. Armed with this intelligence, Isabella made a decision that would have been unthinkable for most colonial women. She decided to confront Father Thornton directly. She requested a private meeting under the pretense of seeking spiritual guidance about her upcoming engagement to Jonathan Pierce, a young merchant from Annapolis. The meeting was scheduled for a Thursday evening in February 1737 in Father Thornton's study. Father Thornton received Isabella with his usual paternal warmth, offering her tea. But Isabella had not come for pleasantries. "Father Thornton," she began, her voice steady, "I have reason to believe that you have been violating the sacred seal of confession for purposes of financial extortion." The priest's benevolent expression didn't waver, but Isabella noticed a subtle tension in his posture. "My dear child," he replied with gentle concern, "I fear that your upcoming marriage, and the natural anxieties it brings, may be causing you to have troubled thoughts. Perhaps we should discuss these concerns in confession, where I can offer proper spiritual guidance." "I have no intention of confessing anything to you," Isabella responded firmly. "Instead, I want you to explain why your sermons consistently reference the specific sins that parishioners have confessed to you privately. I want you to explain why families who confess certain transgressions subsequently receive requests for increased charitable donations. And I want you to explain the unusual construction of your confessional booths." Father Thornton's benevolent mask finally slipped, revealing a cold, calculating gaze. "Miss Ashford," he said, his voice now a subtle threat, "I fear you have developed some very dangerous ideas, the kind of ideas that could cause great distress to your family if they became widely known. Perhaps it would be wise for you to focus on preparing for your marriage and leave theological matters to those with proper training." Isabella stood to leave, but his next words stopped her at the door. "I trust that this conversation will remain between us. Your family has such a sterling reputation in this community. It would be tragic if that reputation were to be damaged by unfounded accusations against a servant of God." As Isabella walked home, she realized she had not only confirmed her suspicions, but had also made herself a target. The priest's final words were a clear threat. cooperate with his schemes or face consequences that could destroy her family's social standing. But Isabella Ashford was not to be intimidated. She had a plan that would either expose the Thornton network or result in her own destruction, and she was prepared to accept either outcome for the sake of justice. Isabella's plan required resources, allies, and discretion. She had identified the crime, confirmed the method, and confronted one of the perpetrators. Now she needed proof to convince the Catholic Church's hierarchy to act against the Thornton network, and she needed it before Father Thornton could retaliate. The key was to access the basement chamber beneath St. Bartholomew's, where she suspected the recording system was located. She had studied the church's architecture for years and had noticed anomalies: a perpetually locked door in the basement, unusual acoustics in the nave suggesting hidden chambers, and the fact that Father Thornton often disappeared for long periods when no services were scheduled. Her opportunity came during the annual Lenten retreat in March 1737, when most of the parish would be attending services in Annapolis. Father Thornton had announced that St. Bartholomew's would be closed for cleaning, giving Isabella the access she needed. But first, she had to neutralize the risk that he would retaliate against her family. Isabella's solution demonstrated strategic thinking. She composed a detailed letter documenting her suspicions, including examples of correlations between confessions and sermons, the unusual confessional construction, and Father Thornton's threats. She made multiple copies and arranged for them to be delivered to Bishop Carroll in Baltimore, the governor of Maryland, and her magistrate cousin, Thomas Ashford. If anything happened to her, a trusted family servant held the letters with instructions to deliver them if Isabella failed to retrieve them by a specific date. This dead man's switch effectively neutralized Father Thornton's ability to retaliate without triggering a full investigation. With this protection in place, Isabella infiltrated St. Bartholomew's basement on the second night of the retreat. She had obtained the church keys through her friendship with Margaret Whitmore, the volunteer caretaker. What she discovered exceeded her worst expectations. The locked chamber beneath the confessional area was an elaborate operation. The walls were lined with metal tubes feeding sound from the confessionals above, and a system of curved metal reflectors amplified conversations to startling clarity. But most damning were the hundreds of coded documents filling wooden cabinets, transcripts of confessions dating back nearly 3 years, organized by parish and cross-referenced by the names of the confessors. Isabella spent hours examining these documents, her horror growing as she realized the scope of the network. The files contained transcripts, victim profiles, records of blackmail payments, and correspondence between the 3 Thornton priests. One file, marked with symbols she didn't recognize, appeared to be a list of problematic parishioners. Her blood ran cold as she realized several of these individuals had died under mysterious circumstances over the past 2 years' deaths that were attributed to natural causes, but which the coded documents suggested might have been something else entirely. The most disturbing discovery was a detailed plan for what the Thorntons called their final solution, a systematic expansion of their blackmail network to encompass every Catholic parish in the Chesapeake region, creating a criminal enterprise capable of controlling the economic and political life of the entire colony. As Isabella carefully photographed key documents using a camera obscura technique, she